Okay, so I did not plan to do a video like this, but recently PC Cast and Kristen Cast announced another spin-off of the House of Night series. And as someone who talks regularly about the House of Night series and has read all but the novellas and has a lot of thoughts, I wanted to share my thoughts on this announcement and the bit of synopsis we've been given, and even the cover, perhaps. This is the first book in another series called House of Night Becoming. It is, I know this book is a dark romance. I think, though, it's a dark romance series, probably. And the first book is called Stolen. Stolen follows Shawnee as an adult. This is like a few decades, I think, after the end of the original series. So she's a full-grown adult. Her life is in shambles, or it doesn't really explain how, it just says that her life is falling apart and she returns to Tulsa. Now, here's where the premise gets a bit sticky, because the core plot is that she gets kidnapped, or as the book is called, stolen by a witch. There's witches now. She gets stolen by a witch. Here's the thing. For those unfamiliar, Shawnee is one of the only Black characters in the House of Night series. So her first instance of getting a central story, she's had a subplot before. She did get a subplot at the end of the original series, which amounted to her effectively changing from being half of a character to a whole character. Still a very two-dimensional character, but at least not half of one. But that was ultimately like a pretty small subplot, and it was more like, it was as much about Aaron as it was about Shawnee. Now Shawnee is getting a book focused on her, and it is about her being stolen. One of the only Black women in the House of Night series has a book about her being stolen. Now, I don't know anything about the love interest other than his name is Bishop Vane, and he's a witch. He's part of a secret society of witches. But I am nervous that PC Cast and Kristen Cast may have made the very ill-advised choice to make this love interest a white man, particularly because throughout the House of Night series, they love to emphasize the importance of white men broadening their horizons and dating women of color. So I'm worried for that potential choice. And the thing is, like, yes, it's a dark romance. Dark romance is going to have dark things in it, like abduction, like assault, like, lots of triggering and upsetting things. That, of course, it's dark romance. The thing is, though, and bear in mind, I don't read dark romance, so I don't know as much about the genre like firsthand, but I've definitely seen reviews of other dark romance books, and I have some notion of what dark romance entails. But my understanding is that part of the appeal of dark romance is the acknowledgement of the fact that it is dark. Like, part of the appeal of reading a book about a man who is chasing and hunting down a woman is the fear. That is part of the appeal. And so in order to really get into that, you have to fully acknowledge and fully embrace how horrifying those implications are. And I think it's also worth noting that from what I have seen, most dark romance, particularly the popular dark romance, is white. It's a white woman and a white man. And so the implications of things like abduction are very different. Shawnee, as a Black woman being abducted, has different implications than a white woman being abducted because of the history of, slavery. And also just like modern day, there's women of color are subject to lots of abduction and terrible, terrible, terrible things. So the implications are different. If PC Cast and Kristen Cast, because Kristen is actually writing on this series to my understanding, if they do actually fully embrace and dive into the implications of a Black woman being abducted, I would probably have less issue with it, because then that becomes part of the darkness and the like borderline horror elements of a dark romance. Not editing Rachel, just later Rachel with further thoughts. I'm not sure exactly where I'll fit this in the video, but I'll throw it in somewhere. I kind of touched on the idea of like when you're dealing with a genre like dark romance, there's certain things that are kind of like a given or acceptable, or like that's just part of the trappings of the genre, like abduction. And this is true of a handful of other genres, but it's important to note that it is not a get out of jail free card. Like you don't get just a blanket pass on everything because you're writing a dark genre. So, you know, in horror, there's going to be horrifying things. It's going to be full of stuff that keeps you up at night, that makes your skin crawl, that makes you feel sick to your stomach. If a horror novel doesn't make you feel unsettled or upset, then it hasn't done its job. You know, grim dark fantasy is going to have all kinds of bloodshed and death and just misery because it's grim dark. That's the point. And dark romance is going to have lots of really disturbing and toxic dynamics, and especially power dynamics, because it is a dark romance. That's part of the genre. Now, that doesn't mean you can just throw in whatever upsetting or horrifying thing you want, and because it's in this dark genre, it's fine. So, like, you know, a horror novel that's about, I don't know, liars having mushrooms grow out of their skin or some shit. I don't know. I don't read horror. If that's like kind of the premise and that's the horrifying element, this aspect of body horror, this aspect of like sin and consequence and it manifesting in this extremely visceral physical way, that's one thing. That is what the book is doing. To then throw in, say, a character being homophobic is like, that just on its own, like just randomly having a homophobic character in a horror novel, the fact that it's a horror novel does not excuse or justify the presence of homophobia. There would need to be a purpose to the homophobia, and particularly a purpose that serves the narrative. So maybe like in this fucked up example, maybe if the character who is homophobic, maybe if every time they say or do something homophobic, a mushroom grows out of their skin, we realize that, oh, they're acting out of internalized homophobia because they themselves are gay. And like we're getting to see the ways in which internalized bigotry against oneself is a form of self-destruction. That would work, but it has to be done with intention and awareness. And the same is true with dark romance. An abduction plot, ordinarily, fine. That's a trapping of the genre. An abduction plot with a Black woman is different and should be confronted as such. And that's where my concern is I don't know that these authors are going to actually grapple with and confront the additional layers of horror, honestly, associated with Black women being abducted or stolen. My issue is that having read romantic stories from both of these authors, PC Cast in particular, I don't trust their ability to do that. PC Cast regularly writes romances and romance subplots that are incredibly disturbing with seemingly zero awareness of the fact that it's fucked up and concerning. So like if she wrote a book with a Black female protagonist and made a white man the love interest, I don't think she would pause and interrogate the implications of that white man stealing that Black woman. I just don't think she would do that. And I'm also not super confident of Kristen Cast's ability to do that. Granted, I have read less of her solo work, and what I have read doesn't grapple with topics like that. However, in the most recent Kristen Cast book I read, The Lovers, there is this subplot about, technically it's the main plot, but it feels like a subplot, about the women of the kingdom, like, staging an uprising, essentially, and it's a revolution, and they're fighting against their oppression, but, like, it's barely developed, and we have basically no named female characters involved in this uprising. So, like, I'm also not super confident about her ability to, like, really dive into a topic like this. I do also want to talk a little bit about the choice of cover design. I'll pop it on screen again so you can refresh your memory. But first of all, I think it is a choice to have the character on the cover have her back to the camera Because, and like maybe this is because I'm looking at it on a screen, maybe it'll look clearer in person when I have a, like if I get a physical copy or something. But to me, this is a character who, or a model who is kind of ambiguous in terms of ethnicity or race. It looks like they might have somewhat darker skin, but it's very easy to glance at this cover and just see it as a white woman if you don't know that this is supposed to be a black woman. Normally, I wouldn't necessarily be hugely concerned about that, but with the history of this kind of thing in the publishing industry, like there have been books of where like the main character is a person of color, but the cover model is a white person. And so I'm like a little concerned about the ambiguity here, and particularly about like the choice to not have any part of her face show is, I don't know. I especially if you look at the original House of Night series, like yes, Otherworld, every cover had someone with their back to the camera effectively. But Otherworld had a completely different artistic style of cover compared to this book. And the original House of Night series also had a different style of cover, but it showed faces. You could see parts of people's faces on the covers. So it would not be, like in terms of the overall trajectory of how these covers are done, it would not be out of the realm of normalcy to have at least part of the character's face shown. And I think it's a choice to have it be her back instead. It's doubly a choice because in this little article, they talk about the choice to have a phoenix on Shawnee's back and how that's like symbolic and like rising from ashes and stuff like that. But the problem with that is they didn't need to show her back to have a phoenix image. Shawnee, her adult mark as a vampire is phoenixes. She has phoenixes around her face. So they could have showed her in profile and had a phoenix on her face and it would have done the same thing. So why did we choose to show her from the back? That actually is more confusing because what do you mean she has two phoenixes on her face and one on her back? Let her have a different tattoo design. So I just think that like that's all an interesting series of choices. I also think the way Shawnee is described in this article is curious. It talks about her like getting the most dramatic character transformation of the series, and I'm like, what do you mean? All that happened is she went from being half of a character to kind of a whole character. She still doesn't do anything. So like you could remove the twin subplot from the original House of Night series and all that would happen is you wouldn't get to introduce Shaylin. That's it. Except you could still introduce Shaylin because you could still have, sorry, there's going to be spoilers in here. You could still introduce Shaylin because whether Shawnee and Aaron are friends or not does not preclude Aaron from suddenly dying. So Aaron could still suddenly die and then Shaylin can be added to the circle. I will acknowledge that Shawnee does have a small role in the like Kelowna redemption arc because of her relationship with her father, which isn't explored very much. But again, that could have happened without the twin subplot, and it's like a very small moment. It amounts to like a chapter. So my point of Shawnee doesn't really do a whole lot in the original series still stands. Particularly, she doesn't really do a whole lot that isn't specifically tied to her role in Zoe's circle as the person representing the element fire. And she's never really explored beyond that. It's just, now I'm not half of a person, and that's as far as it goes. I also find it interesting that it claims Shawnee became a true leader in her group of friends when, again, Shawnee doesn't really do anything. And in fact, in the Otherworld series, original Shawnee is largely written out of that series. She barely appears. And that's done so that they can make other Shawnee more of a character. And other Shawnee has even less going on than original Shawnee. Her role is just to be a love interest, essentially. She doesn't get a character arc or a subplot. So, I mean, I guess she kind of sort of speed runs the twin breakup, but Aaron's barely ever on page, so that also doesn't really count. Those are just like interesting choices of how to describe Shawnee, and like obviously it's done in the interest of like drumming up this story and making it sound like a really big deal that we get more from this character. But it's like Shawnee is a very, very shallow character. Like, she's as close to a blank slate as you're going to get for a pre-existing character. So it's pretty easy to just throw her into a new story compared to someone like, say, Stevie Ray or Aphrodite, where they have like a much more robust character and arc. The decision to describe Shawnee as having one of the most dramatic character transformations when Aphrodite is there, and like even Stevie Ray to a degree. Stevie Ray goes through a lot of ups and downs, and like this is even acknowledging that I don't think either of those character arcs or subplots were handled well. I can still acknowledge that I could at least see the movement of their character and how they changed and grew. Where with Shawnee, I'm like, okay, she had a falling out with her best friend. I guess that's something. There's also this interesting choice where it describes the original House of Night series as YA fantasy and horror, which like certainly there's some horrifying elements in it. Like there's just like weird shit happens, but I would not call the House of Night series a horror series. And I think the choice to describe it as horror in this article is again similar to like drumming up Shawnee as this bigger deal than she was in the original series. I think it's being done to try and make this transition into a new genre more logical. If it's just a YA fantasy and now it's suddenly a dark adult romance, that feels kind of jarring. But if it's a YA fantasy horror and it's turning into a dark romance, that feels a little bit more like, oh, they just like changed up the dark elements and matured it. But it's like, it wasn't in horror, though. It certainly could have been horror, and that would have been an interesting decision and would have given an additional like layer to the series. But I would not call the House of Night series horror. And I think, again, that is only being categorized that way to make the dark aspect of this adult romance seem more logical. I'm also just not confident in PC Cast and Kristen Cast's ability to write a truly dark romance because certainly PC Cast struggles with tone in her descriptions, and like I'm just thinking of Into the Mist and how it's supposed to be apocalyptic and horrifying, and it has some moments that are horrifying, but then you spend like 20 pages with characters talking about wine and looking for furniture, and it's like, is there supposed to be tension here? Like, what's happening? I also want to acknowledge that as much as PC Cast constantly talks about how she doesn't write for a specific audience, she doesn't write for a specific genre, she just writes what she wants to write, and then the publishers slap labels on it later. There is certainly, as far as I have noticed, a pattern of PC Cast and Kristen Cast writing to trends. When romantasy was a thing, they both started putting out romantasy. And some of it, like, yes, the label of romantasy is definitely something that, like, a publisher put on it. But some of it is also, like, no, it kind of feels like you were trying to, like, jump into this because it was a big thing. Particularly with Kristen Cast. I might do a video unpacking Kristen Cast later, but to make things very brief, I recall there being an interview where Kristen Cast was talking about how she actually doesn't like writing fantasy. She only writes fantasy when she's writing with her mom. And she prefers to write, like, thriller. And now she's writing a romantasy series about tarot, which is like very much into, because she said she doesn't like writing all the magical stuff, but now she's writing something that's like very much magic based. It seems like there's an element of trend hopping in their writing. And so I'm definitely like concerned about how much are they really taking this seriously and being respectful of the genre, versus how much are they just like, ooh, dark romance is big right now. What if we wrote a dark romance together? And that being as far as that decision went. Anyway, I've rambled about this long enough, I think. I'll jump in if I have other thoughts, but I did want to make sure I like talked about it while it was still fairly fresh. I will leave this video here. If you made it this far, leave a flower emoji down below in reference to the inexplicable flower petals all over this book cover. I don't know what flowers have to do with anything. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!